So module 3 part 4 is quite a big one actually, this one. Quite a detailed, it's about rebutting a claim.
Yeah.
So the topics we're going to be covering are the 8 admissions on legislation.gov.uk that legislation is not law, covering the Bill of Rights of 1688, Crown and Parliament Recognition Act of 1689, primary legislation is statute law, law must be rational, which equals impact assessment, Acts of Parliament are policy, Acts of Parliament equals a common law contract, secondary legislation is agency law subject to primary legislation, case law equals the force of law, logic and reason test, the Boris Johnson prorogation judgment 2019, the rules of equity creates lawful excuse and prevails the event of a conflict with the common law, lawful contract creates duties, rights and obligations, fraud unravels all, if you want equity you must do equity, and the claimant must prove their case innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah, so following on from the last one, and in this module, the Bill of Rights, this really brings it together and again is the detailed rebuttal that legislation is not law. And most of these are found actually on legislation.gov. So basically, what is legislation then if it's not law? Primary legislation is an instrument created by Parliament assembled and is merely statute law, which is administrative law. Then secondary legislation is merely law where there's delegated authority from primary legislation. And we'll see that legislation cannot be law because to lie is to go against the mind, ignorance of the law is no excuse, all are equal under the law and nobody's above the law. And one of the most famous people in regards law in the country is Sir William Blackstone, and his reasoning, I'll read the whole quote out for you. Again showing this is all old stuff, it's nothing new. And as the saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. If we choose not to learn our lessons from history, we're doomed to repeat them. So he says, for as God, when he created matter, and endued it with the principle of mobility, established certain rules for the direction of that motion. So when he created man and endued him with free will to conduct himself in all parts of life, he laid down certain immutable laws of human nature, whereby that free will is in some degree regulated and restrained, and gave him also the faculty of reason to discover the purport of those laws. Such among others are these principles, that we should live honestly, should hurt nobody, and should render to everyone his dues. So, first rebuttal of a claim that legislation's not law is, we'll look at the Bill of Rights. We've looked at it in more detail before. And basically, Parliament can do nothing to the prejudice of you and me. This is in line with the monarch's promise, our respective laws and customs. And in the Bill of Rights it says, no declarations, judgments, doings or proceedings to the prejudice of the people in any of the said premises ought in any ways be drawn hereafter into consequence or example. So that's the power of the Bill of Rights. Whatever's stated in there is all of our rights, and Parliament can do nothing to prejudice that. It goes on, so shall be esteemed, allowed, adjudged, deemed and taken to be all, to be that all and every of the particulars aforesaid shall be firmly and strictly holden and observed as they are expressed in the declaration. And further goes on that all officers and ministers whatsoever shall serve their majesties and their successors according to the same in all times to come. So this reaffirms the power of the Bill of Rights and what's expressed in there. And nobody subsequent to the creation of that document can go against the Bill of Rights. Parliament, the debate of who's the boss, and we looked at this with the Bill of Rights, with the Boris Johnson judgment. Okay, that there also reaffirms it, which is where we finish here again today. The second rebuttal is found in the Crown and Parliament Recognition Act 1689, where it says in the last sentence that all singular and acts made and enacted in the said Parliament were the laws and statutes of this kingdom. And then it continues to say, and as such ought to be reputed, taken and obeyed by all the people of this kingdom. And as such ought to be is how they're trying to rely upon that it actually is law.
Yeah.
It's very clearly says, because it's the statutes of the kingdom, law statutes of the kingdom, which is the legal fiction, they now trying to force it upon the people. So that's the second rebuttal. The third rebuttal, now the rest of them, all of these are on the website, so these are open admissions. That means it's settled. This is not in dispute. And so if anybody comes with a claim based on this, this is how it's rebutted. Primary legislation is statute law, which reaffirms the Crown and Parliament Recognition Act. And it's sometimes referred to as statutes, or the statute book, or the statute law in current force. The fourth rebuttal is law must be rational, and we've again discussed this in many times, that Lord Diplock's decision expression of what rationality means. Now on the government website, legislation.gov.uk, one of the tabs on each piece of legislation has a option under more resources called impact assessment. So if there is no impact assessment, it cannot be lawful. That there then is merely advice and guidance. And if there is an impact assessment, it must be verified to be rational as defined by Lord Diplock. So rational means it must have a legitimate aim, it must be logical and reasonable and follow logic and reason, and it must show that the chosen action is the one that is the most reasonable and least impacts ourselves. So this, like I say, if it's irrational, it's unlawful, as Lord Diplock defines, so outrageous in its defiance of logic or of accepted moral standards that no sensible person who had applied his mind to the question to be decided could have arrived at it. The next one is Acts of Parliament or policy, and that's found still under impact assessment, where it says very clearly it allows those with an interest in the policy area to understand why they're proposing to intervene. So very clearly it uses the word policy. The sixth rebuttal is an Act of Parliament is merely a common law contract between consenting parties. It says Act of Parliament, it doesn't say law of the land, so even the word itself tells you this. So who the contracting parties? Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons. So these are the people who are involved in this contract, and their capacity is the Parliament assembled, and the consent is by the advice and consent, which is the meeting of the minds, and by the authority of the same. So they themselves have this declared authority, and that together creates a simple common law contract. The seventh rebuttal is secondary legislation is agency law, i.e. it's subject to the primary legislation, so hence it's simple master-slave or principal-agent, however you want to look at it. The next one's the most telling. If you scroll down on the understanding legislation, you get a little section called case law. And what it says is, case law is the set of rulings from the court judgments that set precedents for how the law has been interpreted and applied in certain cases. So this goes back to what we were saying before about common law precedents being the jurisdiction of the UK. And guess what? It continues to say, case law is not held on legislation.gov.uk. So where the hell is this case law? And this is why we have to look at the judgments. But essentially, the way that they have Bibles of case law, so to speak, if you've got lots of money, you can buy different specialist versions of case law where people go through judgments and abstract. So for instance, you'd have on family law, you have on property law, you have on trust law, etc. So it admits and says there, on its own, that legislation is not law. It's how the courts interpret it when we settle a dispute about the interpretation of our respective duties, rights and obligations. So let's just do the simple common sense test. For some reason, whatever it might be, Parliament decides all must jump off the cliffs of Dover on Monday.
Is that logic and reasonable?
Absolutely. It wouldn't be law. And that there is testing to the extreme. For something to be lawful, it would stand the test of truth. So, and finally, we've looked at in detail on the Boris Johnson judgment earlier, where it's affirmed that neither Parliament nor the government are the creators of law, and the conclusion is that the people are the boss when we resolve disputes in the courts, and it's been this way for centuries. So all in all, really, anybody claiming that they've got legislation is law is very easily rebutted. Further, if we look within the legislation itself, there's something called the Senior Courts Act 1981, and Section 49 reaffirms that equity is supreme over the common law, and you argue lawful excuse based upon the rules of equity, where the existing law does not offer a fair and just remedy. So lawful contracts create duties, rights and obligations, hence the importance of the monarch's first promise and second promise. And all of our interactions are largely always boil down to a contractual relationship, which means there must be a meeting of the minds, extremely important, and that there gives something the force of law. And one very important document, many people have issues about debt and things like that. The Master of the Rolls, which is one of the highest authorities within the court system, in 2017, late 2017 or 2018, brought something, created a public document called the Pre-Action Protocol for Debt Claims. Now this is very clear that any legal body, including public bodies, so any public body also must provide proof of contract. That is a most important tool. So finally, if there's not a meeting of the minds, this essentially is a fraud, if it's done with intent. This goes back to 1762, very famous judgment, Montefiore versus Montefiore, and guess what? It's another family dispute, because this is where most of this comes up, which states, no man shall set up his own inequity as a defence any more than a cause of action. So that means if I create a dispute, I cannot benefit from that. So I can use it to no further avail. In 1921, another case, Crane versus the Director of Public Prosecutions, stated, if an order is void ab initio, that means from the beginning, then it is no real order of the court. So even if the court makes an order based upon fraud, it has no standing. Lord Denning, he in 1961 said, "A void order is incurably void, and all proceedings based on the invalid claim or void act are also void," i.e. once you start an action in dishonour, everything that comes thereafter. Even a decision of the higher courts, which is the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, will be void if the decision is found to be invalid, to be founded on an invalid claim or void act, because something cannot be founded on nothing. Common sense. This is why I say the law we have is very good. And this is reaffirmed in a very famous statement which Lord Denning said, "No court in this land will allow a person to keep an advantage he has obtained by fraud. No judgment of a court, no order of a minister can be allowed to stand if it has been obtained by fraud. Fraud unravels everything. The court is careful not to find fraud unless it's distinctly proved, pleaded and proved. But once it is proved, it vitiates judgments, contracts, and all transactions whatsoever." So this reaffirms absolutely, if you want equity, you must do equity. Equity is the highest expression we have of the laws of nature in relation to interactions between people. And simply act in honour, good faith, and with clean hands. And finally, the claimant must prove their case. We are innocent until proven guilty.
As always.
As always.